Hello, welcome to our Stand Against Racism. We'll be getting started in about 3 minutes. Hello. Good, I guess it's afternoon. My name is Sharon Roberson, President and CEO of the YWCA of Nashville and Middle Tennessee. I am so thankful that each of you have taken this time out of your day to join us in our Stand Against Racism series. Today, we have an important message for you. Because if you are a person like me, you know that education is the foundation for a successful life. There are many lessons that you will learn from being an educated person, not the least of which is understanding how to be a critical thinker in our society. First of all, I'd like to thank the Nissan Foundation for funding this effort. They are a corporation that has determined that it is important to have these community conversations. I want to say we view these as a safe place for open dialogue. We want you to understand that we are inviting members of our community, not indicting them. So there is no question or no position that is too controversial for us to take on and understand. Because if we don't talk about these issues openly, we cannot move the community forward. Today, we're going to discuss the impact of what we are viewing as a system that has the result of marginalizing children of color and also children who are poor children in our society. And this is shortchanging them. Before we get started with the two educational funding issues, I wanted to put this in a historical context. Because unless we understand our history, we do not understand how to move our community forward. I want to make sure that people understand that it used to be against the law to teach enslaved people to read and write. For instance, in the Virginia Criminal Code of 1847, any white person who assembled slaves or free Negroes for the purpose of instructing them to read or write could be sentenced to jail and fines. So we have to put in the context that it was not only something that people did not do as far as educating enslaved people or even freed people. It was something that was actually against the law in states. We all understand the 1896 court ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson. This is where it became the law of our land that separate but equal was okay. That it didn't matter if we had segregation so long as the facilities were equal. Now, I put this in the category of a dream state because never have we been able to treat people equally in the United States of America. This is our aspirational goal, and we move toward that, and we hope that that occurs. But this did not function in the way that it was viewed to be functional. We know what happened in 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education. And there are many in our society said, well, you know, Brown v. Board of Education said that we were going to integrate our public school system and that we would be okay, and this was a starting point. But what we need to understand about this portion of our history is the way that this was actually implemented had a negative effect on children of color, specifically Black children. When I was reading about this, I thought that, wow, this, my own personal experience, I had no clue was really something that was the experience of so many people and really a deliberate act. What integration meant was that the Black schools, the schools that the Black children attended were shut down because they were not going to bus white children to these neighborhoods. The institutions, the Black principals that were part of those neighborhoods, they were demoted. The Black teachers were marginalized. When the Black students went into those classrooms, they were separated from their peer groups and did not have support. And this was my experience. You did not have your classmates you were used to being. You did not have that loving embrace of a Black teacher. And so that started a fundamental decline in educating children of color in our school system. Added to that, we have a Girls Inc. program at the YW and a Men Together program. And we are in the public school system, helping our young girls understand that they can be strong, smart, and bold, and helping young boys understand healthy masculinity. When I go to these public schools to observe our programs, I see Black children. And I'm wondering, are there, you know, there's so few white children that are part of the public school system. In Nashville, what I didn't understand, and I understand now, is that after World War II, when the GI Bill, you know, we used to have a draft system and most people served in the military. When they got out, these local banks were giving out the GI loans and the bills. Heavily, heavily biased toward white individuals, and they were able to move into a suburban environment. And we are now seeing the results of that significant change. Now, everything doesn't come and result from the things that I have just set out, but many things did. But I think it's important when we look at what we're going to discuss today to put everything in that historical context, because history we are living today. Now, we have experts in our field, and they're going to talk about some of the things that are going on. I want everyone to be educated about the facts of the situation, because we cannot afford to have a generation of children that are lost because we failed to do what we need to do as a community educationally. And we're going to challenge the people on this call at the end of this to step into that space and support these individuals that are advocating for these changes. First of all, we're going to talk about two educational funding issues. One deals with K through 12 and one deals with higher education. Tennessee has basic educational programs and a funding formula. How does that affect our children? And also, as you may have read in the news, historically Black university, land grant institution of TSU, and monies that are rightfully owed to these institutions because they are the foundation of the education system of so many people of color in our community. First of all, I'm going to ask each of the panelists as I call on them to introduce themselves, including the work that they do and their understanding of the state of public education in Tennessee. I will start off with Charles K. Grant, an esteemed lawyer in our community. I don't know how many Charles Grants exist because he's doing so many things that it is amazing. So thank you, Charles, and I'll start with you.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for inviting me here. And, I have to get my disclaimer out there. I'm a proud board member of the YW and really appreciate all the excellent work you're doing in leadership. So thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm a shareholder here in Nashville in the law firm of Baker Donaldson. We're proud to represent the plaintiffs in a lawsuit against the state over education funding. We have a long tradition, unfortunately, of having to sue our state over education funding, beginning with Louis Donaldson and the small school cases back in the early 1990s. There were 3 cases that went up to the Tennessee Supreme Court called the small schools cases over education funding. And unfortunately, we're still at it. We represent Shelby County schools and metro schools today in a lawsuit that's been pending for 6 years against the state to try to do right by our children. The fact of the matter is that the state is failing public school kids in K through 12. And whether those kids are Black, white, brown, disabled or English language learners, the state is failing to bring to task the resources necessary to ensure that they get the education they need. And I want to start out by noting that any criticisms of the school districts, candidly, and we've been involved in this litigation for 6 years. We have looked at we've deposed over 70 people. We've got 10 experts. We have hundreds of thousands of pages of documents that we've reviewed in discovery. We got to have a pretty good idea of what the state of education is in Tennessee. And I do want to note right off the fact that any blame directed at our teachers is simply misplaced. They're overworked, they're underpaid, and they're under-resourced. We have to lay the blame where it lies, and that's with the state legislature. A little bit of demographic evidence here for your consideration. The state has 1 million students in its public schools, 64% of whom are white, 23% of whom are Black, 9% Hispanic, and over 40% are classified as at risk or coming from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. And that is a large share of them obviously are in the 2 largest urban school districts here in Nashville and over in Memphis, but they're also found throughout the state in a lot of these small and rural school districts as well. So we're here to talk about the fact that the state is failing our children in a number of meaningful ways. And I want to give you a data point before we go forward with some other introductions and discussions. A critical testing period in education is 3rd grade English language arts. In Tennessee, we have only 32% of our children throughout the state who are proficient in English language arts in the 3rd grade, and that's just absolutely horrible. The State Department of Education has determined that meeting expectations in 3rd grade English language arts is an indicator of future academic success. Okay, what's going on in Shelby County? Only 14% of our children in Shelby County are proficient in English language arts. And Metro, unfortunately, is not much better. Only 22% of our children in Metro schools are proficient in English language arts. What does this mean? This is a disaster. This is the formula for failure. We have to do more. We can do more.
All right, thank you, Charles. And now I turn to Gini Pupo-Walker.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's so great to be here with the YW and with you. I will also say I was a YW board member for 6 years, very proud of that, and part of the board that brought on Sharon. So very proud of that accomplishment. Formula for failure. Charles, I'm I'm going to steal that one from you. So that's saying. So I'm Gini Pupo-Walker. I work for the Education Trust in Tennessee, and I'll talk more about that work a little bit later. But I also serve on the school board here in Nashville in District 8, and on the board that is currently suing the state on the funding formula, and Charles so wonderfully representing us. And I grew up in Nashville, went to public schools here in Nashville, and was in schools when desegregation began, really the real desegregation began in the city, and have a lot of experiences related to that, and just a lot of memories about what that looked like in practice, and what was hoped for and what actually ended up happening. And as we know, that story continues to evolve. And very much I've spent my life as an educator, was a teacher, high school level, college level. I've worked in the nonprofit world, Conexión Americas, and now at Education Trust, and have spent my entire career really advocating for students, for communities. Have spent a lot of time in my private life working very hard on issues related to the Latino community in Nashville, serving on many boards, advocating on their behalf. And so, just see this work and this funding conversation through different lenses, as a Nashvilleian, as an educator, as an advocate, as a parent, as a daughter. And so happy to talk about any of those today, and eager for the conversation.
All right, thank you. And Kiah will go now to the next level, higher education.
Hi, thank you. Glad to be with you all today. My name is Kiah Albritton, and I'm a Policy and Communications Associate at EdTrust Tennessee. It's okay, Sharon, the H throws people off all of the time. It's Kiah like the car, is what I tell people to help them remember. So my work is really focused on post-secondary access and ensuring that students of color and students from low-income backgrounds are able to access, persist, and ultimately complete higher education. I've been with EdTrust for about a year, and we are steadily building out our higher ed agenda, and have just been really focusing on and working on making sure that the state's colleges and universities are more equitable for Black and Latino students specifically. I think that our first stake in the ground around that was a report we released last year called Segregation Forever, that examined how well represented Black and Latino students were at the different community colleges and public institutions in the state. We've also worked at looking at some of the state's performance-based funding system in Tennessee, which is outcomes-based funding formula, working with our national team to seek out ways to make sure that Black and Latino students are more well-represented, and campuses that are serving those students are more well-represented and equitably funded as well. But I'm also really excited to be in the conversation with you all today, and to learn from, and to talk about some ways that the funding can be better for not just on the P-12 side, but for higher ed too.
All right, thank you. Well, let's dig a little bit deeper. But before we go there, I would like to know of any sort of, even if anecdotal, personal experiences or anything that you can give us of your own personal experience of inequitable funding for public education in Tennessee. Have you heard from students, from individuals? Have you seen it yourself? I'll start with you, Charles.
Sorry about that. Like Jenny, I was born and raised here in Nashville, and I was educated in our public schools. I graduated from Overton, what seemed like a long time ago, 1979. But when I graduated from Overton, by any measure, it was one of the best public schools in the state. We, had all of the advanced placement courses and all of the extracurricular activities. We had a lot of very seasoned and devoted, well-trained teachers. And, I really felt like I thrived there. What I didn't know at the time was that I was probably at Overton, even though didn't live that far from Overton. I grew up in Nashville in the Melrose area. I was probably there at the time because of some efforts at court-ordered desegregation that had started in the early 60s. And so, I was able to get the benefit that education, even when I was at John Trotwood more before that. And so I wasn't aware of that. It was only when I come back later that I found out that the funding was pretty much been flat for the last 40 years, if not decreasing, and that a lot of the rich programming that I was exposed to is no longer there, and it's not in a lot of our public schools. It's disheartening to see what I think Gini and I talked about as benign neglect going on with our public school educational system. When I left, I was prepared for college, went to college, and obviously graduated from college. I wonder about the fact that only 40% statewide of Tennessee students today are prepared for college. And it's even worse in our urban school districts here in Nashville and down there in Shelby County. And it's obviously some of the rural school districts as well. So that's part of what drives me to want to make sure that the state does better by our students. One other personal note I want to share. You mentioned about the law in Virginia in 1847 about it being against the law to teach slaves and free blacks how to read and write. It wasn't that long ago, right? My grandfather was born in Kentucky in 1865. So I am 2 generations removed from that period. And then you look at what happened with all the segregation through Jim Crow, and then through the 1950s and all of the resistance to equal educational opportunities in the 50s and 60s and through the 70s. It wasn't that long ago. And what we're experiencing today is some of the unfortunate circumstances and results of all of that effort at trying to block equal educational opportunity.
Yes, that is so profound. And, that's what I said, people need to understand history because it's a very short history. It's a very short history. Okay, Gini.
I will share a couple of things that for me have been significant in terms of my personal experience. The first one I'll say is, it's ironic, Charles is at Overton. I landed at Overton many years later, actually in 2004, I guess, as a teacher, Spanish teacher and a Spanish heritage teacher. Spanish heritage is the Spanish class for students whose first language is Spanish, like mine, who grew up speaking it but never learned to read and write it in this country. And so often had classrooms full of Latino students who were learning poetry, literature, history, really reading and writing and thinking in Spanish to be truly prepared to go into the workforce as a bilingual individual. But what I saw as Overton evolved, Glencliff, Antioch, all of these neighborhoods evolved with many more Latinos moving in, Kurdish families moving in, lots of diversity, as we know now in South Nashville. When I was at Overton, it was just exponential growth. That continues to be true even today. They continue to see exponential growth of immigrants moving into Overton, attending Overton. But what I know from our funding formula is that it is not designed to adjust and adapt to that kind of changing population. And so the funding did not change for Overton when these students arrived, even though they needed many more types of supports and services. We needed teachers with specific training and endorsements. We needed many more translators. We needed services and translation for parents. We needed really to equip our staff in our school to truly engage with families whose first language is not English. And we're still catching up to that. We're still trying to do that work. And it's tremendously important if we really want all students to succeed. And so our formula is not designed to really support students as our populations change. And when we talk about modernizing our funding formula, changing our funding formula, this is what I'm talking about. This is because our formula is designed for a school system from 1992. This is not the school systems that we have today. And so I saw firsthand how under-resourced Overton was to help these families. And really, frankly, over-reliance on community organizations who don't have the bandwidth and the capacity, as you well know, Sharon, to help every family in need, every student in need. And so it really, obviously many people feel like schools become the catch-all to solve every societal problem, but truly around instruction itself, we just are not funded to do that work appropriately. And the other thing I'll say when we talk about the history and structural things that impact student learning, we're an English-only state. What that means is we cannot teach and assess students in other languages. So teachers are not allowed to offer TCAP tests, TN-Ready tests in other languages. And that is still true. And even Nashville, less than 15 years ago, tried to pass a referendum to make us an English-only city where you couldn't speak another language in courtrooms. You couldn't, in any government proceedings, any government places, second languages were not allowed to be used. So there are still people in our midst who are trying to codify sort of pushing out and limiting and marginalizing communities who are citizens, who are members of our community, who are paying taxes, who are really contributing, but yet we seek to marginalize their voices in that way. So luckily, that referendum failed. Surprisingly, actually, at that time, it failed, but we were glad to see that. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. Okay, Kiah, I know you're a little bit younger, but you two have experiences.
Yes, ma'am. Well, I grew up in rural West Tennessee in Ripley. It's a really tiny town about an hour outside of Memphis. And I, like about halfway through my P-12 educational experience, we moved to Rutherford County. And I could even remember at that young age being very aware of the different resources and how many teachers were in the building and the different types of activities and after school programs that I had access to in my new county versus growing up in a really rural, really Black, poor community just on the other side of the state. And then I think as I progressed into applying for college, I went to the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and those disparities, those challenges were still really, really apparent, and maybe even more so. The types of ACT prep, and Charles spoke about academic preparedness that my cousins that still lived in West Tennessee and Ripley were getting versus what I was getting, like I said, just 3 hours up the road, right, in Murfreesboro. And the way that that has just kind of dominoed into going on to complete a graduate degree versus like, are you able to pay for college application fees and paying for transportation to getting to campus? Like, it's just a very different the way that we invest in students' P-12's journeys sets them up for so much of the rest of their lives. Like things that you can't, it's hard to dream and to imagine what you can't see. And I think that my like world of opportunity opened up in a way that I benefited a lot from, but I know that there are people in my family and people in my life that just didn't have that same access. And a lot of it boiled down to funding and to resources. And it's, I think heartbreaking and just kind of sobering to hear you all talk about how so many of the same issues that, right, like we've just been fighting the same fight for so long. And I think we know a lot of the solutions in terms of, and I know we'll get into this in a minute, in terms of restructuring that funding and putting resources to the students in greatest need, but that is just continues to be the story, and it's part of mine as well.
Well, thank you. So each one of you has given us sort of a personalized version of this, but we know that for every individual story, there are systems and structures in our society that keep this happening over and over for multiple generations. What I want for you is to talk about how these structures or systems and how they are impacting or affecting what we're seeing today as far as educational funding. Why is this bigger than the individual? Why is this a systemic issue that we need to address? And I'll start with you again, Charles.
Well, let's look at how Jenny mentioned the BEP, the basic education funding. You introduced us to it, Sharon. Basically, it's a formula with 47 components that's supposed to fund every aspect of a public school education in Tennessee. One of the critical aspects of that formula is called at-risk funding. I think it's at $885 per at-risk student that a school is supposed to receive. How this number is arrived at is an excellent illustration of why it's broken, why public school funding in Tennessee is broken. The $885 is totally arbitrary. When we deposed a number of the folks from the state on how they arrived at that number, because a number of our experts have said that the number should be closer to $3,000 to $5,000 per student. When we asked the folks at the state how they arrived at that number, to a person, it was, we don't know where the number came from. Now, it was adjusted a little bit over the years, but where does it come from? Where does it come from? What is it based upon? In other words, there is no relationship between that number and what it actually costs to educate at-risk children. And when you take that and multiply it by the 400,000 children that we believe are at risk in Tennessee, Black, white, brown, or what have you, then you can get a glimpse into the funding issue at play.
Wow, those numbers are striking. Jenny?
Sharon, could you repeat the question for me? I was kind of struck by
Really,
Charles.
I know. Charles has blown my mind so much I forgot the question too. But what we're talking about is you each talked about your individual stories and your observations, but we know there's a bigger picture here because we're talking about a system, a strategy, things that are put in place that are bigger than an individual story. Because some people may think, well, such and such is doing okay, or this one, and you all have been successful, and I call it despite the obstacles. And so we want to know, why do you view this as a systemic issue as opposed to an individual issue?
Well, one of the things I admire so much about the YW is that you have right there in your tagline, eliminating racism, right? And we know that education, K-12 education, is the place where students are trained to think critically, to work with different folks different than themselves from their own community, to really learn how to work in this and function and succeed in this community, in this society. And so when I think about how our funding system is set up today, it has a lot of inequities baked into it. And so I'll just do a quick review here. About 10% of funding to K-12 schools in Tennessee comes from the federal government. Anywhere between 40 to 70% comes from the state, depending on the wealth of the local district. There's a formula truly involved where money is sent to districts based on the local capacity to raise taxes, to raise money to pay for the remaining portion, right? And so what you see built into that are a couple of major flaws. One is the basic education program, the BEP formula, is that it's just grossly underfunded in general. So when we say it's an inadequacy issue, it is because it is inadequate. It is not enough to educate children in Tennessee today. And so roughly $6,000 more or less come to districts from the state, more or less. And so in Nashville, for example, the average per pupil expenditure, what we spend per pupil on average is around $11,000. Some students cost much more than that. Children with very critical special education needs, physical needs, for example, cost more. But if you think about $11,000 per student for a year, right, which is meant to cover teachers, transportation, food, facilities, curriculum, training, all of the different things, it's simply not enough. And when you think about a school like a Montgomery Bell Academy in Nashville, where the tuition is $30,000 or higher, okay, so when you think about what a world-class education costs, it actually costs 3 times what we're giving children in Nashville, right? And so I believe that the parents in metro schools aspire for the same things for their children as the parents in MBA. And so what we're doing is a disservice to these families. And so when we say it's inadequate, the state is simply not putting enough money into the formula to truly let districts do what they need to do to teach students. there's a term called effort, meaning, and we rank very low on effort. Effort meaning what proportion of the state's overall budget goes to education. It's relatively low. We also know that there's a vast rainy day fund sitting there, right? We're a low tax state, but we also have money set aside that we're not spending. And so we need to think about that effort, the amount of money the state actually puts in. And it's common across the South. The South is famous for underfunding education year upon year. And then the last thing I'll say is really around equity. Are we distributing the money that we get in a way that is targeted to the students that need the most help, whether they're in a distressed county, whether they're in Tipton County, or whether they're in Memphis or Nashville or wherever, right? And so when we think about equity, right, which is really what this is about, is equity through funding. I always use an analogy of my own children, because people often think of equity as a buzzword. What does it mean? If you have something, that means, if I give you something, that means I have less, right? It's a zero-sum game. I think about my two children. I have a son, Eli, and a daughter, Sarah. If you have more than one child, you know every child is different, has different talents, different ways of doing things, right? Sarah is a go-getter. Her first sentence in her life was, I do it. She's 25, 24. She is still doing it. She takes care of her stuff. She's really resilient. My son, Eli, much more sensitive, much more, he's not as proactive about taking care of his needs. He didn't love school. I had the exact same goal for both of them, just like we all have the same goal for students in Tennessee, that they graduate thriving, ready to succeed wherever they go. I wanted my children to succeed no matter what they chose to do. It required two different sets of resources and strategies to get Sarah and Eli to the same place, which was with a college degree. And so he needed a lot more tutors and supports and pushing and carrots and sticks and all the things, right? And so I think we have to do the same thing on a state level. How do we figure out what it is that each child needs and how do we fund it? And so you will see the Education Trust, where we work, where Kiah and I work, really pushing an agenda, an aggressive agenda on reimagining our funding formula, doing what we call a student-weighted formula, where every student has a profile. We attach a dollar amount to what it takes to educate a child in that profile, whether they have a disability, whether they're learning English, whether they're from a low-income community. What does it actually cost to teach them so that they're equipped? And then let's figure out how do we pay for that. And so it is systemic. It is about deciding what we care about and funding the things we care about. People often say a budget is a moral document. Our budget says what we value, right? And so we have to show that we value education, whether it's in K-12 or post-secondary, and that requires really reimagining the whole kit and caboodle. And that's really what we're talking about.
I'll go to you, Kiah.
Thank you. I think that was excellent from both Charles and Gini. I would just add that though the outcomes-based funding formula, which is how the public colleges and universities in Tennessee are funded, that formula is not as complicated, in my opinion, as the BEP. I do think there's still some work to be done. We see across the country, and our state's no exception, that the colleges that serve greater percentages of students of color and students who are from low-income backgrounds, they often don't have, they have less resources than the students that, or than the campuses that are educating wealthier, typically white students. And so our funding formula does not do a great job of accounting for race at all. It does account, it allows for some calculations around low income students, but as we've already said today, that does not always capture the same population. And so I think consistently seeking out ways to make sure that we are getting more resources to the campuses that need them most. And it's not as sexy of a conversation in higher ed, talking about funding and talking about ways that funding can be more equitable. But I think it's a really, really important one. Tennessee has done a great job so far, honestly, leading in the conversation and making sure that some of its campuses are funded really well. We'll see the issue with TSU, it demonstrates a whole other side of that coin, which I think we're about to get into. But for the most part, that outcomes-based funding formula is funded to its maximum potential. It just like could be done in a more equitable way.
All right, when we look at this, because this is part of our Stand Against Racism series, and throughout all of this, there are issues that are part of how race works in our society. How do you see the issue of race or racial justice fitting into this discussion today? Is it just by chance these are, certain racial concentrations in funding are targeted? How are we looking at this in terms of how race is affecting, how underfunding is affecting us on a race level? And I'll start with you, Charles.
It's a complicated question to look at it funding from a race perspective, except to note that when the lawsuit was first filed against the state, that the one that we're prosecuting now, it was just Shelby County. And the perception by most legislators on the Hill is that we're giving Shelby County enough money, they're just not managing it right. They weren't looking at the hard data. And I wonder how much of that was through a lens of a perspective that it's predominantly Black county in terms of the public school population and how it's being run at central office. When you look at what the evidence says in terms of management of the funds that are being provided, they are performing at a very high level. The same is true here in Metro. So it's not a money issue in terms of how it's being spent. It's a resource issue. I want to comment further on something that Gini said about the budget is a moral document. It's about effort. The fact of the matter is that Tennessee spends about 2.9% of all taxable resources on public education. 2.9%, the lowest in the nation. And it's not a question of whether it has the resources, okay? It has the resources. We spend less per pupil than Kentucky, which has a lower GDP than Tennessee does, substantially less than Kentucky. So we're even at the bottom of a low spending South. That's how bad it is. But we do know this last fiscal year, we had $2 billion in surpluses. We do know that we have nearly $8 billion for the rainy day fund. And we're proud of our AAA bond rating. But in the meantime, we're only get 40% of our students who are graduating from its high schools statewide, who are ready to move on after high school for gainful employment and further education. So it is a moral question. It is a political question. It is a choice. It doesn't have to be this way.
All right, wow. And Gini, that is a profound statement that this budget is a moral document. That is so profound because we know, as I said, from our own experience in our clubs in the public schools, we're dealing with children of color, whether or not that's brown, Black, we're dealing with children who have different sexual orientations. We're dealing with children that vary so much, and it's truly a disservice to those students. Why do you think that those characteristics of our students, their color, their sexual orientation, et cetera, why do you think the system is working against them, Gini?
Well, I mean, again, I'll go back to the fact that our system is underfunded, right? If you put X number of dollars into a system, you're going to have outcomes come out the other end of the system. And what we see then are a whole host of disparities in those outcomes, whether it is around academic achievement. We know that Black and Latino students with disabilities, English learners have the lowest performance statewide on any statewide assessment. We see that drop significantly during the pandemic, cause for serious concern, but it only is exacerbating what we know to have been true all along. And so, when I think about students who need additional types of supports, whether they're around social emotional learning, around dealing with grief and trauma, whether it is around a sexual orientation, whether it is around any kind of system, a situation where a student just requires additional support, we see another manifestation of this poor funding formula where we have a really low number of mental health supports, low numbers of, or I should say a huge like ratio of one social worker to hundreds of students, one counselor to hundreds of students, one nurse to hundreds of students. That kind of lack of support for our students, one means that students just are falling through the cracks and not getting the help they need. And really sometimes they have to leverage, parents have to leverage any kind of social capital they have. If a family doesn't have social capital to leverage, that student really does often suffer. And I think we also see where schools have really creative, really strong principals. Will do things like get a Girls Inc. into the building. We'll get an after-school program into the building. We'll get mental health co-op into the building. They'll try to supplement what they can with community-based organizations. And none of that comes through the BEP formula. I mean, you know, the YW has to raise money every year to offer these types of programs. The district should be paying you to offer those programs to our students instead of the other way around. And so I just think what we see then is we see students who require additional types of supports and resources, or maybe not additional, but just a very culturally sort of responsive, thoughtful way to serve students in each community. We just need to have the resources to do that really well.
All right, and going to you, Kiah, now for years, I believe the figure is at $500 million that TSU is owed. I couldn't believe that we had dollars like that going around. But I would say for years, every ill that you would see at our HBCUs, the whole label of they, whoever they might be, but they tended to be Black people, could not manage well. There's management. The funds are not used well. They're given a lot of resources. They are misappropriating almost. There were all these allegations, but little did we know we were sitting back and people in those ivory towers criticizing that this type of underfunding was existing. Kiah, can you give us some more flavor of that, or what is going on?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Sharon. I think we've all heard stories and seen articles about the infrastructure issues at Tennessee State University. The funding that's at the center of discussion for that campus is related to its status as a land grant institution. And so Tennessee has two land grants. One is TSU, obviously, and the other is the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. And so those campuses receive federal funding because of their land grant status, and that federal funding requires a match from the state. And what the big legislative report that came out last summer, this past summer, a few months ago, revealed was that from 1970 to 2007, Tennessee State University did not receive their match funds from the state. And there was never a year that UTK did not receive their funding. In fact, there were some years that they received over the amount that they were allotted to or expecting to. And I just can't imagine a world in which we would be having this conversation about a predominantly white campus. Like, I just don't think we would have gotten to this point without it's neglectful. And I think there's been a lot of conversation about who exactly is responsible. But I think at the end of the day, like, our state government failed that campus. And if it weren't for the students and alumni and administration at TSU ringing those alarm bells, who knows how long it would have taken for us to get to a point where there is now a number, and the campus and the legislature are at a point where they're trying to work together to figure out what repayment looks like. But it also just will never account for all of the years that that money just wasn't there, and they were having to dip into general funding, and having to, my grandma says, right, like, make a way out of no way is what they've been doing for decades and decades and decades. And I'm glad that we've reached a moment where the conversation is now about retribution and repayment, but that figure is only that figure, but can't account for all of the years and all of the students and faculty and staff that were impacted by those lack of funds.
Yeah, and it's hard for us to make up that opportunity. And I will say that That was just very striking and disheartening, and I cannot figure out how this could occur. You hate to put labels on people, but someone somewhere, this was a deliberate act to deny access to these funds by Tennessee State University. Someone knew what was going on. They knew it wasn't an equitable situation. But this is why it's so important to understand our history, because there were people at Tennessee State University that knew, but because of the system that they faced, their voice was not heard. And there are often excuses made. Oh, well, we can't do this now. But until you know the complete story, and I will say this, when there are injustices such as this, and people need to understand this as we speak, those injustices over time will come to light. And that's when people start hiding and saying, but injustice over time comes to light, and people need to understand that. Now, if anyone has any questions, we can put those in the chat, but we always leave our speakers with this opportunity, and this is very significant. We have had a wealth of information provided to us in this talk. We want everyone to understand this is in your toolbox now. When you go out into the community and talk about public education, you need to understand this data. You need to understand where we are, because this gives you what you need to speak, whether it's at your dinner table, whether it's at your club meeting, whether or not it's with your friends who are not educated and do not have this knowledge. This is where we are. So you take the opportunity that you have based on this knowledge to better our community. I'm going to ask each one of you some short-term and long-term calls to action for this audience today, to give them one other nugget or nuggets of information about how they can go into our community and help better this situation. I'll start with you again, Charles.
You got to get informed. And today it's very, very difficult because of all the noise out there with I guess, social media and what have you. And some of that information is just bad information, but you got to get informed. I would recommend that you sign up for Chalkbeat, which is a free publication that comes into your inbox every day with updates on what's going on all issues related to education in your community. I would also ask, and by the way, nobody at Chalkbeat asked me to do that. I just believe in the work that they do, just for the record. I also suggest you may want to go and sign up for the education report. That's a blog about education issues going on in Tennessee. It's being run by Andy Spears, but there may be other sources of reliable material out there that you can look to as well. Those are the two that quickly come to mind. Obviously, sometimes the local newspapers do cover education. Gini just sent a text out with how to access Chalkbeat, but first become informed, then go out and become active and reach out to your legislators and let them know that they must do better by public school children and fully fund education in a real meaningful, effective way.
All right, Jenny.
So, I'll echo what Charles said. Definitely, information is power, but then you have to know what to do with that information. And so I'll do some promotion here. So the Education Trust in Tennessee leads a statewide alliance, and you can see I've just posted in the chat who we are and who our members are and what our policy agenda is. You can dig in there. A big pillar of our policy agenda is around funding and resources and what we think needs to be true for schools in Tennessee. And so you can join our alliance there as an individual. The other thing you can do if you really want to dig in deeply on any element of funding reform, I'm going to put in the chat here our Dollars and Cents series. This is a 7-part series we hosted this year. Charles was a featured speaker on this series, and it covers everything from how school funding works to how the BEP works to what could be different and how you get there. And the other thing I'll say is pay close attention to the state legislature and what's coming up in this next session. If you don't know who your state legislator is, I encourage you to go to the Tennessee General Assembly website. Familiarize yourself with who represents you in the Senate and in the House. Make sure they hear from you that you are an active, engaged constituent and that you are deeply concerned about the level of funding, the type of funding that is being offered to a place like Nashville. And then the other thing I will say is the trial, the funding trial that is going to court that Charles is helping lead is happening in February. Chalkbeat, I'm sure, will be covering that in great detail, but you should pay attention to that because I think the outcome of that trial could be really, really important in terms of what happens next for our funding policies in Tennessee. So really important to stay up to date, to stay engaged. We always host webinars, events. Once legislative session starts, if you're on our mailing list, you'll get a weekly legislative newsletter. We'll tell you what bills showed up this week, what's on tap for the following week, why it matters, what matters, how it's aligned to our priorities of equity and racial justice in education. And anyone in Tennessee is welcome to subscribe and participate and be involved in our work. And vote, register to vote, please vote.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
And Kiah?
Yeah, I think so many similar things from what Gini said, because of course we work together. I would add for the TSU issue specifically that it really has been the folks on their campus and Representative Harold Love Jr., who might be some of your legislatures, but he has been leading the issue. The folks on that campus have been leading the issue. Their alumni chapter here, I know, has been really engaged and well. So I think that those are great entry points in case folks are interested in advocating on that. We, I think, are at a moment, a bit of a turning point there since the legislative committee has convened and they're now working together to try to figure out what that repayment looks like. So I would stay engaged with those groups and with us, of course, for any future advocacy pushes, because that situation is just not over at all in any way, shape, or form yet.
All right. Well, I did receive one other question. I don't know if it's a proper question, but at this point in the game, I think we need to go for it. I was texted a question that all of these avenues of receiving additional funding are very expensive. Specifically, litigation is very expensive. What can individuals do to support these efforts? And that's for anyone.
Well, reach out to your local school districts. I think it's important to recognize that Metro Schools is paying its lawyers to prosecute this case. It has made the very, very difficult decision of diverting of some of its resources to sue the state in order to get more resources for the children that's entrusted to it to educate. But I do think it's important. It's not just Metro schools. It's not just Shelby County schools. Another 87 school districts are represented in this lawsuit as well. So 89 of the 146 school districts throughout the state. So school districts throughout the state are suing the state in order to get a court to order the state to provide more funding. So reach out to your local school districts and ask for a little guidance on how you can help support that effort on the litigation front.
All right, well, thank you. This is perfect. Again, I thank Nissan Foundation for being a forward-thinking entity, corporation in our state to really fund this. I cannot thank the speakers enough and really take this issue to heart. My mother passed away earlier this year, and she was a teacher for over 40 years. She started in a 2-room schoolhouse in Augusta, Arkansas, and worked from there. She went on to college on the back of a segregated bus, and it would be remiss if I did not push for educational funding. She often said that people learn more in that 2-room schoolhouse than they ever learned in classes when she retired, because they had teachers that fought for them and loved them and cared about them. I also have to, before we let you go, give out to Sister Sam about the love and caring and education in this community. If you don't know her, you should. So thank you all for all you contributed to this discussion, and it should not stop here. So thank you. And we also have a survey for those who are in attendance they can fill out. But thank you so much to all of you, and thank you to the Nashville community for supporting the YWCA.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Mhm.